The tractors were not displayed where customers could see them. They sat behind the dealership, beyond the polished showroom and the rows of new machines with clean tires, bright paint, and financing signs hanging from their steering wheels. The broken tractors were kept near the back fence. Some had blown engines. Some had cracked transmissions. Others had been damaged by fire, floodwater, or years of hard work. A few had been left there so long that weeds had grown through their wheels. To the dealership, they were not machines anymore. They were problems. Every broken tractor occupied space. Every old model required time. Every repair estimate created another argument with a farmer who could not afford the bill. The dealership had a simple policy. If a machine could be repaired quickly and sold for a profit, it stayed. If the repair cost was too high, it went to the back lot. If parts were no longer available, it was marked for disposal. Daniel Hayes had worked there for 6 years. He was not a manager. He was not a salesman. He was the mechanic people called when a job was dirty, slow, or not profitable enough for anyone else. He changed oil, replaced bearings, cleaned fuel systems, removed broken bolts. Most days, he worked on newer machines, under bright lights inside the service building. But during lunch breaks, he often walked through the back lot. He looked at machines everyone else had stopped seeing. One tractor had a burned engine compartment, but the rear axle was untouched. Another had a broken transmission case, yet its hydraulic pump still turned freely. A third had been rolled onto its side, crushing the cab but leaving the engine block, wheels, and lift system intact. The dealership saw broken tractors. Daniel saw separate parts. One afternoon, the owner, Grant Holloway, walked into the workshop carrying a clipboard. "We are clearing the back lot," he announced. The mechanics stopped working. Grant explained that the dealership was expanding its storage area. Every unusable tractor had to go. The machines would be sold by weight to a scrap company. Old parts in the warehouse would be thrown away if they had not sold in the past 3 years. No more shelf space would be wasted on obsolete equipment. One mechanic laughed. "About time." Another said, "Most of those tractors have been dead longer than I've worked here." Daniel said nothing. After work, he walked through the yard again. There were 43 machines marked for removal. He counted them twice. Some were almost empty. Others still held engines, gearboxes, steering assemblies, hydraulic cylinders, and rare cast housings. Inside the warehouse, workers had already started filling metal bins with old inventory, seals, bearings, control valves, starter housings, gaskets, parts still wrapped in faded paper. Daniel picked up a hydraulic valve and checked the number stamped into the body. He recognized it. A farmer had asked for that exact part 2 months earlier. The dealership had told him it was unavailable. Now 3 of them were being thrown away. The next morning, Daniel approached Grant. "What would you take for the tractors?" Grant looked at him as if he had misunderstood. "All of them, the machines and the old parts." Grant laughed. "You know they are being scrapped because they are not worth fixing." "I know. Then why would you want them?" Daniel looked through the workshop window toward the back lot. "Because not every part is broken." Grant shook his head. "You would need land, trucks, storage, tools, and more money than those machines will ever return." Daniel still asked for a price. Grant gave him one slightly above scrap value, mostly as a joke. Daniel accepted. By the end of the week, he had signed the papers, rented an abandoned feed yard outside town, and borrowed enough money to move the machines. People came to watch the first load leave. The dealership employees stood near the gate as an old flatbed truck carried away 3 rusted tractors. Someone called Daniel a scrap collector. Someone else said he would be broke before winter. Grant watched quietly. He was satisfied. The dealership had cleared its land and earned money from machines it had already written off. Daniel had taken the problem away. What none of them understood was that Daniel had not bought 43 tractors. He had bought engines, pumps, shafts, gears, wheels, valves, steel frames, and thousands of components that had never been inspected separately. The dealership had judged every tractor as one complete machine. Daniel planned to take them apart, and hidden inside the machines everyone had thrown away was the beginning of a business none of them could yet see. Daniel had understood the value of old machinery long before he bought the dealership's discarded tractors. He learned it on his father's farm. When Daniel was 17, the family owned one tractor large enough to handle most of their fieldwork. It was old, loud, and difficult to start in winter, but it had served them for years. Then it failed during planting season. The problem was not dramatic. The engine did not explode. The transmission did not collapse. A small internal component in the fuel system wore out and stopped the tractor from running. The part itself was inexpensive. Finding it was not, Daniel's father called every dealer within driving distance. One shop said the model was too old. Another offered to order the part, but delivery would take several weeks. A third suggested replacing the entire fuel assembly. That repair cost more than the family had available. The weather made the situation worse. The fields had finally dried after heavy rain, and another storm was forecast within days. Every lost hour reduced their chance of planting on time. Daniel and his father removed the damaged component and carried it from shop to shop. Mechanics recognized it. No one had one. At the final dealership, a salesman looked at the worn piece in Daniel's hand and said, "You may need to start thinking about a newer tractor." Daniel's father looked through the showroom window at machines they could never afford. He did not argue. He simply put the broken part back into his pocket. The family borrowed a neighbor's tractor for one afternoon. But it was not enough. They prepared only part of the field before rain returned. When the ground dried again, the planting window had narrowed. Some seed went in late. Some rows emerged poorly. The harvest that year was weak. The tractor was eventually repaired, but by then the damage had already been done. Daniel never forgot the lesson. The farm had not suffered because the entire machine was worthless. It had suffered because one small part was unavailable at the exact moment it mattered. Years later, while working at Holloway's dealership, Daniel saw the same pattern repeatedly. Farmers brought in older tractors with limited problems: a damaged pump, a cracked housing, a worn steering box, a broken lift arm. The machines still had useful engines, strong frames, and years of possible work left. But if the dealership could not order the correct part, the repair often ended. The customer was shown a newer machine. The broken tractor went behind the building. Daniel began paying attention to what happened next. Some machines sat untouched. Others were stripped quickly for obvious components. Most were eventually sold as scrap. He noticed that one tractor could be rejected because of a failed transmission, while still carrying a good engine. Another could have fire damage in the front, but an intact rear assembly. A machine with a cracked block might still contain a working starter, hydraulic valve, PTO unit, or steering system. The dealership did not have time to examine every possibility. Its business model depended on speed, new parts, standard repairs, new equipment sales. Daniel understood why. But he also understood who was left behind. Small farmers, older landowners, people with machines that were still useful but no longer profitable for the dealership to support. That was why he walked through the back lot during lunch. He was not collecting old metal in his imagination. He was counting possible solutions. A hydraulic pump could keep a loader working. A gear set could save a transmission. A wheel hub could return a hay tractor to the field. A small casting could protect an entire planting season. When Grant Holloway announced that everything would be discarded, Daniel felt the same urgency he had felt years earlier beside his father's broken tractor. This time, the missing parts were not hidden in warehouses far away. They were sitting in front of him. They were attached to machines nobody wanted. Buying the lot was still a risk. Daniel had borrowed money. He had rented land he could barely afford. He had no guarantee that the parts would sell. Some machines would contain more damage than value. Some components would be unsafe. Some would never match anything a customer needed. But he knew the need existed. He had lived through it. On the first evening at the new yard, Daniel walked between the unloaded tractors with a flashlight. The machines looked worse outside the dealership. There were broken windows, flat tires, missing panels, and years of dirt. He stopped beside a faded tractor with a damaged engine and placed his hand on the hydraulic housing. That part might be good. It might not, but somewhere nearby, a farmer could already be searching for one. Daniel opened a notebook and wrote down the model number. Then he wrote a second line beneath it. Do not value the machine by the part that failed. That sentence became the foundation of everything he built afterward. The dealership had thrown the tractors away because each one had stopped doing its original job. Daniel had bought them because he knew one failed job did not erase every useful thing that remained. Moving 43 tractors cost Daniel more than he expected. The purchase price had been manageable. Transportation was not. Some machines still rolled. Others had locked wheels, broken axles, or missing steering components. Several had to be dragged onto trailers with chains and winches. One was so badly damaged that the transport company charged extra just to load it. By the time the final tractor reached the rented feed yard, Daniel had used most of the money he had borrowed. The property itself offered little comfort. The main building had a leaking roof. The concrete floor was cracked. The electricity worked only in half the workshop. Outside, the tractors stood in uneven rows among old grain bins, veets, and broken fencing. From the road, the place looked less like a business than a mistake. People in town treated it that way. Some drove past slowly to stare. Others stopped and asked whether Daniel was planning to start a scrapyard. A former coworker from the dealership visited during the first week. He walked around the lot, looked at the rusted machines, and laughed. You left a steady job for this? Daniel kept unloading tools. I did not leave for the tractors. What did you leave for? What is inside them? The mechanic kicked a flat tire. What is inside this one? Mud? Daniel ignored him. He had no interest in winning arguments. He needed to find out whether his idea was real. The first step was choosing which tractor to open. He did not choose the cleanest machine. He chose one of the worst. Its engine had seized after years without proper lubrication. The hood was bent. The electrical system had been stripped. One rear tire had split open. The dealership had considered it completely worthless. That made it useful as a test. If Daniel found nothing inside, he would know the risk was larger than he thought. He pulled the tractor into the workshop and began taking it apart. The work was slow. Bolts had rusted in place. Hydraulic fittings refused to turn. Dirt filled every opening. Daniel labeled each component as he removed it. Engine accessories, fuel system, hydraulic system, steering, rear lift, transmission, wheels and structural steel. He placed clearly damaged parts in one area and possible reusable parts in another. By the end of the first day, the tractor looked even worse than before. It had no hood, no seat, and no wheels. Anyone looking through the door would have thought Daniel was destroying the only inventory he owned. But the floor told a different story. The engine block was unusable, but the starter housing was intact. The hydraulic pump turned freely. The rear lift arms had little wear. The PTO shaft showed no visible damage. Several gears inside the transmission were clean and protected by oil. The steering assembly needed rebuilding, but the main housing was sound. The machine would never run again. Its parts might keep several others working. Daniel wrote down every part number he could find. Some were clear. Others had to be cleaned with a wire brush before the markings appeared. He measured shafts, bolt patterns, and mounting points. By midnight, his notebook contained pages of information. It was not enough to prove he had built a business, but it proved the dealership had discarded more than scrap. The next morning, Daniel found something even more important. Tucked inside a storage box on the tractor was an old service tag from a previous repair. It listed the model, year, and replacement numbers for two hydraulic components. One of those numbers matched a part he had seen in the dealership's discarded warehouse stock. Daniel searched through the boxes he had purchased with the tractors. After nearly an hour, he found the part. It was still wrapped in faded paper, unused. The dealership had thrown away a new component because the number was no longer active in its modern system. Daniel placed it beside the used hydraulic unit from the tractor. The connection became clear. The machines were only part of the opportunity. The forgotten records, old numbers, and abandoned inventory were just as valuable. He needed more than shelves. He needed a way to connect every part to every machine that could use it. That afternoon, Daniel created 3 categories: tested and usable, rebuildable, material only. He knew those labels were temporary. A part could not be called usable until it had been inspected and tested. A rebuildable component might require more work than it was worth. Material could still become something else. But the categories gave order to the chaos. By the end of the week, Daniel had dismantled only one tractor. It had produced dozens of potentially useful components and several pieces of heavy steel bakes. The rest of the yard still looked overwhelming. 42 machines remained. Bills were coming. No customers had arrived. Daniel stood in the workshop doorway and looked across the rows. For the first time, the scale of the gamble frightened him. He had not bought a ready business. He had bought a mountain of unknowns. Then he looked back at the parts arranged across the floor. The dealership had seen one failed tractor. Daniel had found a pump, a steering housing, lift components, gears, stale, and a trail of part numbers connecting old machines to forgotten inventory. That was not an empire. Not yet. But it was enough to prove the first layer of value was real. The machines had been thrown away whole. Daniel's future depended on learning how to understand them piece by piece. Daniel spent the next several days turning the workshop into a place where parts could be understood. He built shelves from old lumber. He marked sections on the floor with paint. He cleaned one wall and hung tools in order. The yard still looked rough. But inside the building, a system was beginning to form. The first tractor remained in the center of the shop. Most people would have called it destroyed. Daniel no longer saw it that way. He saw 3 different things inside it: parts that could return to work, parts that could be rebuilt, material that could serve another purpose. That distinction became important almost immediately. The hydraulic pump looked usable, but Daniel refused to sell it without testing it. The steering housing appeared solid, but the internal seals had hardened. Several gears were in good condition, but one bearing had begun to fail. The tractor was not full of ready-made profit. It was full of possibilities that required judgment. Daniel cleaned each component and placed a tag beside it. Part number, machine model, visible condition, work required. He added one final line to every tag, confirmed or unconfirmed. That line mattered more than the others. A part could look perfect and still be wrong. It could fit physically, but fail under pressure. It could turn smoothly by hand and break under load. Daniel had seen enough rushed repairs at the dealership to understand the danger of confidence without proof. He borrowed a small hydraulic test unit from a retired mechanic and connected the pump. The machine made noise at first. Pressure rose slowly. Daniel shut it down, cleaned the inlet, and tried again. This time, the gauge climbed and held. The pump was worn, but still serviceable. He marked it as tested. The steering unit required more work. The housing was good, but the seals leaked, and one internal surface was badly scored. Daniel separated the usable pieces and placed the rest in the rebuild section. The transmission produced the greatest surprise. The tractor's engine had failed, but the sealed gearbox had protected several components from weather and dirt. Inside were gears, shafts, and selectors that still showed clear machining marks beneath the oil. The machine had looked dead from the outside. Its most valuable pieces had been hidden in darkness. By the end of the week, Daniel counted the results. One tested hydraulic pump, one rebuildable steering assembly, several usable gears, a PTO shaft, rear lift components, two wheel centers, a set of heavy brackets, several feet of structural steel. The tractor itself would never return to the field, but it had already created more potential value than the dealership had received by selling it to Daniel. That was the first proof he needed. Still, the work created another problem. Daniel could not dismantle every tractor at once. If he opened machines without a plan, the yard would become a larger pile of unidentified parts. He needed to know what farmers were actually looking for. So he placed a small sign near the road. Old tractor parts, tested, rebuilt, or located. The sign was hand-painted and uneven. For 3 days, nobody stopped. On the 4th day, an old pickup entered the yard. A farmer named Henry Cole stepped out carrying a broken cast metal housing. He placed it on Daniel's workbench. The dealer says this part is no longer available. Daniel recognized the shape. It belonged to a rear lift system on an older utility tractor. He checked the number. Then he looked toward the rows outside. One of the discarded machines was from the same model family. Daniel did not promise anything. He walked Henry to the tractor and checked the casting number. It matched. The part was still attached to the machine. The housing had surface rust, but no visible cracks. Daniel removed it, cleaned it, and inspected the mounting points. The internal seals needed replacement. The casting itself was sound. Henry watched from the doorway. How much? Daniel named a price far below the cost of replacing the tractor. Henry did not bargain. He only asked, "How soon can it be ready?" Daniel finished the rebuild the next day. The part returned Henry's tractor to service before the end of the week. That single repair changed the yard. Henry told his neighbors. One called about a starter. Another asked for a wheel hub. A third wanted to know whether Daniel bought damaged tractors. The first tractor Daniel dismantled had now done more than provide inventory. It had created trust. The dealership had thrown it away because it could no longer be sold as a complete machine. Daniel had separated it into smaller answers. That was the beginning of the real business. Not selling scrap, not restoring every tractor, finding the useful part inside the useless hole. The call came just before sunrise. Daniel was opening the workshop when the phone rang. A farmer named Thomas Reed had lost the hydraulic system on his tractor. The machine still ran, but the rear lift would not rise. His baler was already attached, and rain was expected the following evening. Thomas had called the dealership first. They told him the replacement part was no longer stocked. The only available solution was a newer assembly that required additional modifications and cost more than Thomas could afford. His second option was to leave the tractor at the dealership for several weeks. Neither option helped him. His hay was already cut. If it stayed in the field through heavy rain, much of it would be ruined. Thomas arrived at Daniel's yard carrying the damaged hydraulic valve in a wooden box. The metal body was cracked near one mounting point. Daniel cleaned the surface and found the casting number. He recognized the sequence. One of the tractors in the back row used a similar hydraulic system. "Do you have one?" Thomas asked. "I may have the correct housing." Daniel said, "But I need to confirm it." They walked through the yard until Daniel reached an old tractor with a burned engine compartment. The front half of the machine was blackened. Several wires had melted. The tires were damaged. But the fire had not reached the rear hydraulic assembly. Daniel checked the casting number. It matched. The control linkage was slightly different, but the main valve body appeared to be the same. He removed the assembly and carried it into the workshop. Thomas watched the entire process. "How long will this take?" Daniel looked at the cracked part, then at the replacement. "If the inside is good, today." That was the most he was willing to promise. Daniel opened the salvaged valve body. The oil inside was dark, but there were no large metal fragments. The internal spool moved freely. The main surfaces showed wear, but no deep scoring. The seals were old and had to be replaced. One spring had weakened. Daniel used a new seal kit from the dealership inventory he had purchased and replaced the damaged spring with one from another rebuildable unit. Then he compared the control linkage. The salvaged assembly had been designed for a slightly different lever position. Instead of forcing it to fit, Daniel transferred the original external arm from Thomas's broken valve. The main housing remained unchanged. Only the correct control piece was reused. By noon, the rebuilt assembly was ready for testing. Daniel connected it to his hydraulic test unit. Pressure rose. The valve held. He cycled it several times and checked for leaks. None appeared. Thomas stood near the bench, watching the gauge. Will it work on the tractor? It passed here, Daniel said. Now it has to pass under load. They drove to Thomas's farm and installed the assembly. The tractor started immediately. Daniel asked Thomas to move the hydraulic lever. The lift arms rose slowly. Then they stopped. Thomas looked at Daniel. Daniel checked the linkage and found the adjustment was slightly short. The valve was opening, but not fully. He shut down the tractor, corrected the linkage length, and tried again. This time, the lift arms rose to full height. They held without dropping. Thomas connected the baler and drove forward. The machine lifted the equipment cleanly. No unusual noise. No oil leak. No hesitation. Daniel walked beside the tractor for several minutes, checking the repaired assembly. Only when it stayed dry and stable did he allow himself to relax. Thomas began baling that afternoon. By evening, most of the hay had been moved from the field. The rain arrived the next morning. It fell hard enough to flatten the grass along the roadside. But Thomas's bales were already under cover. The story spread quickly. Farmers did not describe the repair in technical language. They told it simply, the dealership had thrown away a burned tractor. Daniel had taken one part from it and saved another farmer's harvest. That story brought more people to the yard. A man came looking for a steering arm. Another needed a fuel pump housing. A repair shop called about an old PTO assembly. The demand had always existed. Daniel's successful repair made people believe he might actually be able to meet it. But the most important change happened inside the workshop. Daniel created a new section in his notebook. Under each part, he wrote not only where it came from, but what it had done after leaving the yard. Hydraulic valve repaired Thomas Reed's tractor. Lift housing returned Henry Cole's machine to service. Pump assembly awaiting test. The records gave the parts a second history. They were no longer pieces removed from dead tractors. They were components with proven work behind them. That distinction increased trust. Daniel did not sell Thomas a miracle. He sold him a carefully inspected, repaired, and tested component. The value came from the process. The part had been thrown away because the tractor around it was no longer profitable. But once separated, identified, and rebuilt, it became exactly what another farmer needed. That was the moment Daniel's idea became more than a salvage yard. He had found a way to turn discarded machines into time. Time before rain. Time before planting ended. Time before a farmer was forced to replace equipment he could not afford. And in rural work, saved time was often worth more than the part itself. Success arrived faster than Daniel expected. After Thomas Reed's harvest was saved, calls began coming from outside the county. Farmers asked about pumps, steering units, gear sets, and lift assemblies. Some brought exact part numbers. Others brought only broken pieces wrapped in oily cloth. Daniel was still working alone most days. He cleaned parts, answered calls, searched the yard, rebuilt assemblies, and kept records late into the night. The growing demand felt like proof that his idea was working. It also made him careless. The mistake began with a transmission gear. A farmer named Robert Hale arrived with a tractor that had lost second gear. The machine still moved, but it made a violent knocking sound under load. Robert needed it for hauling grain. Daniel opened the transmission and found 3 broken teeth on one gear. The rest of the system looked usable. He searched his inventory and found a gear from another tractor of similar size. The tooth count matched. The diameter was almost identical. The shaft opening fit. Daniel placed both gears on the bench. They looked close enough. Robert asked, "Is it the right one?" Daniel hesitated. The part numbers were different, but old catalogs often used revised numbers. Daniel had already seen parts from different models work together. "It should fit," he said. That was the problem. He had checked whether it fit. He had not proven whether it would function correctly under load. Daniel installed the replacement gear. The tractor moved smoothly during a short test in the yard. Second gear engaged. The knocking stopped. Robert paid the bill and drove home. For 2 days, everything seemed fine. On the third morning, Daniel received a call. The tractor had locked in the field. When Daniel opened the transmission again, the damage was worse than before. The replacement gear had failed. Broken metal had damaged a second gear and cracked part of the housing. The cause became clear under close inspection. The gear had the right size and tooth count, but the tooth angle was slightly different. Under light testing, it worked. Under heavy load, the contact between the gears was too narrow. The pressure remained concentrated along one edge until the metal broke. Daniel had turned a manageable repair into a major failure. Robert stood in the workshop looking at the damaged parts. "You told me it would work?" Daniel did not argue. He refunded the repair cost and promised to replace the damaged components at his own expense. The mistake nearly emptied what remained of his savings. It also damaged his reputation. Farmers who had praised his ingenuity began asking whether used parts were safe. Some stopped calling. Others said Daniel was experimenting with machines he did not fully understand. The criticism was painful because part of it was true. Daniel had been too eager to solve the problem. He had allowed confidence to replace verification. For several days, the workshop remained quiet. Daniel used the time to rebuild the business around stricter rules. He created 4 labels for every component: exact match, verified substitute, modified assembly, untested possibility. No untested possibility would be installed on a customer's machine. No gear would be approved from size alone. No hydraulic component would be sold without pressure testing. No rotating shaft would be trusted without inspection. Daniel painted a sentence above his workbench. "Fit is not function." Below it, he added another: "Test the job." Not just the part. The failed gear stayed on a shelf where everyone could see it. Daniel did not hide the mistake. When customers asked about it, he explained what happened. He showed them why the part failed and what had changed afterward. That honesty slowly rebuilt trust. Daniel eventually found a correct transmission housing and gear set for Robert's tractor. The repair took longer and cost Daniel more than the original job had earned, but the tractor returned to work. Robert did not praise him. He simply said, "At least you made it right." That sentence mattered. Daniel understood that the future of the business would not depend on never making mistakes. It would depend on how he responded to them. The yard had started with a simple idea. Broken tractors still contained useful parts. Now Daniel understood the harder truth. Useful parts were not valuable until they had been correctly identified, tested, and matched to the work they were expected to perform. The dealership had thrown away machines because careful inspection took too much time. Daniel's business could survive only if he was willing to spend that time. The mistake cost him money. It cost him trust, but it gave the yard something it had not possessed before: standards. And those standards would become more important than any single tractor he owned. After the failed gear, Daniel stopped treating his yard like a collection of machines. He began treating it like a library. Every tractor received a number. Every major component received a tag. Every tag connected to a record. Daniel wrote down where the part came from, what condition it was in, what had been tested, and which machines it might fit. At first, the system lived in notebooks. One book for engines, one for hydraulics, one for transmissions, another for steering and lift systems. The pages filled quickly. Casting numbers, measurements, model years, replacement numbers, known differences, parts that looked similar but were not. The process was slow, but it solved one of Daniel's biggest problems. Before, a farmer could ask for a part, and Daniel might spend half a day searching the yard. Now he could check the record first. If he had the part, he knew where it was. If it had already failed inspection, he knew not to waste time removing it. If there was a possible substitute, he knew exactly what still needed to be tested. The yard became more efficient. But the records did something else. They revealed patterns. Certain hydraulic pumps appeared across several tractor models. Some steering boxes were used under different brand names. A transmission housing from one machine shared internal components with another model built years later. Daniel began to understand that the most valuable thing in the yard was not the number of tractors. It was the relationship between the parts. One afternoon, a repair shop called about a rare lift control valve. Daniel did not have the exact part number, but his notes showed that another tractor used the same valve body with a different external lever. He found the assembly, inspected it, and confirmed the internal dimensions matched. The original lever from the customer's broken unit could be transferred. The repair worked. That job added another line to Daniel's records: verified substitute. By the end of the year, local mechanics were calling him before searching distant suppliers. They trusted Daniel because he did not simply say a part looked right. He could explain why it matched. He could show the measurements. He could describe the difference. He could also say no. That became one of his strongest advantages. If a part was unsafe, he rejected it. If compatibility was uncertain, he marked it clearly. If a repair needed a new component instead of a salvaged one, he told the customer. Farmers did not always like the answer, but they came back. The business grew enough for Daniel to hire 2 assistants. He taught them to clean numbers carefully, photograph every component, and record facts instead of guesses. Do not write what you think, he told them. Write what you can prove. Soon the shelves carried hundreds of labeled parts: hydraulic valves, starter housings, wheel hubs, gear sets, lift arms, PTO components, axle shafts. Each one had a history. Some came from burned tractors, some from machines damaged in floods. Others came from equipment abandoned after one major failure. The parts no longer looked like random metal. They looked like organized inventory. The dealership had once owned many of the same components, but without a system, they had been treated as obsolete. Daniel's records changed their value. A rare housing was useful because he knew which tractor needed it. A common pump was valuable because he knew how many machines could use it. A damaged component still mattered if its housing or shaft could complete another rebuild. The records helped Daniel make better buying decisions too. He no longer purchased every broken tractor offered to him. He looked for specific machines: a model with a rare rear axle, an engine family with hard-to-find pumps, a tractor known for strong transmissions but weak blocks. Each purchase filled a gap in the library. One day, Grant Holloway visited the yard. He walked past the numbered rows and into the workshop. The shelves were full. The binders covered an entire table. Workers were checking parts against diagrams and measurements. Grant looked around. "You built all this from what we threw away?" Daniel nodded. Grant picked up a tagged hydraulic valve. "How much is this worth?" Daniel answered. "That depends on who needs it." Grant frowned. He still thought in products. Daniel now thought in problems. A part had no value by itself. Its value appeared when it solved the right failure at the right time. That idea became the center of the business. The tractors had provided the metal, the testing had created trust, but the records connected everything. They turned a yard full of broken machines into a system that could be searched, repeated, and expanded. That was the moment Daniel stopped being only a salvage mechanic. He became the keeper of a mechanical library. And every new page made the yard more valuable than the machine sitting inside it. Not every part in Daniel's yard could return to another tractor. Some were cracked. Some were too worn. Others belonged to models so rare that no one had asked for them in years. At first, Daniel placed those pieces in a scrap pile behind the workshop. The pile grew quickly. Bent frames, old wheel rims, damaged hydraulic cylinders, axle housings, steel plates, lengths of chain, parts that had survived, but not well enough to be trusted in their original jobs. A scrap dealer offered to buy everything by weight. The price was reasonable. Daniel almost accepted. Then he looked at the heavy steel in the pile and remembered how the dealership had judged the tractor's whole machine. Repairable or not repairable. Profitable or unprofitable. Keep it or throw it away. Daniel had built his business by refusing that kind of thinking. So he asked a different question. What could these parts become? The first answer was a workbench. A cracked tractor frame could never safely support a machine again. But most of the steel was still thick and straight. Daniel cut away the damaged section, reinforced the remaining pieces, and added a heavy top. The finished bench was stronger than anything he could have afforded to buy. Then he used an old hydraulic cylinder to build a log splitter. The cylinder had come from a loader with a damaged mounting point. Its original machine was useless. The cylinder body was not. Daniel repaired the bracket, added a simple frame, and connected it to a small hydraulic power unit. A farmer saw the machine working and asked Daniel to build one for him. Another farmer requested a heavier version. Soon, Daniel began producing simple tools from material that would otherwise have been sold for scrap. Old wheel rims became counterweights. Axle shafts became pins and support bars. Heavy brackets became trailer mounts. Sections of tractor frames became repair stands. Steel plates became grading blades and bale handling attachments. The work was not complicated, but it required judgment. Daniel did not use damaged metal in places where failure could injure someone. Cracked sections were removed. Welds were inspected. Moving parts were tested. The goal was not to turn scrap into something that merely looked useful. It had to survive real farm work. The new products changed the business. Replacement parts depended on finding a customer with the exact machine and the exact problem. Farm tools had a wider market. Almost every farmer needed strong, simple equipment that could be repaired locally. Daniel focused on tools with clear value. Bale spears, trailer supports, engine stands, small grading blades, hydraulic log splitters. He avoided complex designs. His advantage was not advanced manufacturing. It was access to heavy material and practical knowledge. The tools were less expensive than many factory-built alternatives. They were also easier to repair. If a bracket bent, Daniel could replace it. If a cylinder leaked, he could rebuild it. Customers liked knowing the equipment was built by someone nearby. One afternoon, Grant Holloway visited the yard again. He stopped beside a finished bale attachment. The steel frame still showed faint traces of blue paint beneath the new coating. Grant recognized it. That came from one of our tractors. Parts of two, Daniel said. Grant looked at the attachment. Then, toward the scrap pile. How much do you sell these for? Daniel told him. Grant's expression changed. The steel had not become more valuable because its material had changed. It became more valuable because Daniel had given it another purpose. That lesson reshaped the entire yard. From then on, every machine followed the same path. First, Daniel identified parts that could be safely reused. Second, he separated components that could be rebuilt. Third, he recovered material for tools and fabrication. Only what remained after those steps went to the scrap dealer. The process created several sources of income from one broken tractor. A hydraulic pump could be sold. A steering assembly could be rebuilt. The frame could become equipment. The remaining metal could still be recycled. Nothing was treated as valuable without inspection. But nothing was discarded before its possibilities had been considered. The fabrication side of the business grew steadily. Daniel hired a welder. One of his assistants began producing standard designs. The workshop added a separate area for cutting and assembly. What began as a way to reduce waste became a second business. Farmers still came for parts. Now they also came for tools. The dealership had thrown away the tractors because they could no longer perform one job. Daniel had built his success by finding the second, third, and fourth jobs hidden inside them. The machines were no longer returning to the field as tractors. They were returning as everything the field still needed. As Daniel's inventory grew, a new problem appeared. He was selling useful parts faster than he could replace them. The original 43 tractors had given him a strong beginning, but the supply was not endless. Rare pumps, steering units, starter housings, and hydraulic components disappeared from the shelves one by one. Buying more complete tractors helped, but transportation and storage were expensive. Daniel needed a way to recover parts without filling the yard with more machines. The answer came from the customers themselves. A farmer arrived carrying a failed hydraulic pump. He wanted to buy a rebuilt unit from Daniel, but he asked whether the broken pump had any value. Daniel opened it. The internal gears were badly worn, but the housing was intact. The shaft could be replaced. Several smaller parts were still usable. Daniel offered the farmer credit for the damaged unit. The farmer paid less for the rebuilt pump. Daniel gained a housing he could restore later. Both sides benefited. That simple exchange became a new part of the business. Customers could bring in damaged components and receive credit toward a tested replacement. The amount depended on what remained usable. A broken starter might still have a good housing. A failed steering unit might contain an intact shaft. Two damaged pumps could sometimes provide enough good pieces to create one reliable assembly. The system worked because Daniel no longer judged a component only by the reason it had failed. He looked at each layer separately. Before long, farmers began arriving with shelves of old parts from barns and workshops. Some had kept them for years because throwing them away felt wasteful. Others had no idea what the pieces were. Daniel inspected everything. Many items had no value. Some were too damaged. Some were common enough that he already had more than he could use. But a few contained rare castings, shafts, covers, brackets, and internal components that were difficult to find anywhere else. Daniel created clear rules. No customer received credit until the part had been identified. No component entered the rebuild system without inspection. No damaged part was promised a second life, simply because it looked complete. The exchange program had to remain practical, not sentimental. Still, it changed the way farmers thought about broken equipment. A failed component was no longer automatically trash. It might become the beginning of another repair. The program also lowered costs. Farmers who could not afford new parts now had access to rebuilt units at more manageable prices. Repair shops began collecting damaged assemblies instead of throwing them into metal bins. They sent them to Daniel in batches. In return, they received credit, tested replacements, or rebuilt units, ready for installation. The yard became connected to dozens of smaller workshops. Parts moved in both directions. Broken components arrived. Rebuilt components left. Information returned with them. Daniel recorded how each part had failed, what machine it came from, and which repairs lasted. That information improved his records. If the same weakness appeared repeatedly, he began checking for it before rebuilding the next unit. A certain pump often wore along one internal surface. A steering housing commonly cracked near the same bolt. A starter model frequently failed because heat damaged one connection. The exchange system did more than supply material. It taught Daniel where old machines were weakest. That knowledge made his repairs better. It also created a cycle the dealership had never considered. The dealer sold a part once. Daniel could handle the same component several times. A pump might leave the yard rebuilt, work for years, return with a worn shaft, and still provide a good housing for another assembly. A starter could fail electrically, but continue through its mechanical parts. A damaged unit could become a donor for several future repairs. Nothing lasted forever, but many components lasted longer than one failure. Daniel eventually hired a driver to collect exchange parts from repair shops across the region. The truck left each week, carrying tested components, and returned with damaged cores. The yard no longer depended only on the tractors standing behind the fence. Its supply now moved through a network. Grant Holloway heard about the program through his service department. Customers had begun asking whether the dealership offered credit for failed components. In most cases, it did not. Old units were discarded because sorting and rebuilding them required time. Daniel had built his advantage around that time. He was willing to inspect what others preferred to replace. By the end of the year, the exchange shelves had become one of the busiest areas in the workshop. Every part carried two possibilities: what it could do now, and what it might still provide after it failed again. The dealership had built its business around new equipment moving outward. Daniel was building his around value returning. That cycle gave him something more powerful than a large inventory. It gave him a supply that could renew itself. By the third year, Daniel's yard was no longer a local curiosity. It had become the first place many farmers called when an old tractor failed. The change was gradual. At first, customers still went to Holloway Agricultural Equipment before contacting Daniel. They trusted the dealership's size, its clean service bays, and its official catalogs. But the answer was often the same. The part was discontinued. The repair would take weeks. The machine was too old to justify the cost. A newer tractor could be financed. For farmers already carrying debt, that final suggestion did not feel like a solution. Daniel offered something different. He asked what had failed. He checked whether the original component could be rebuilt. He searched his records for a verified substitute. He inspected the machine before recommending replacement. Sometimes he still told customers the repair was not practical. But he did not begin with a sales contract. He began with the machine they already owned. That difference brought more trucks through his gate. Repair shops also began relying on him. They sent damaged components into the exchange system and ordered tested replacements. Daniel's driver delivered parts across several counties. His workers answered calls from farms he had never visited. The yard remained rough, but the operation behind it had become dependable. At Holloway's dealership, the change appeared in smaller numbers. Fewer repair jobs for older tractors. More customers asking whether discontinued parts could be rebuilt. More farmers taking estimates home without signing. Grant Holloway noticed. At first, he blamed the economy. Then he blamed internet sellers. Finally, one of his service managers placed a list on his desk. It showed how many customers had mentioned Daniel's name in the previous month. Grant read it twice. "He cannot possibly stock all these parts," he said. "He does not," the manager replied. "He rebuilds some, adapts others. He also exchanges damaged units." And customers trust that? They trust his records. Grant drove to Daniel's yard the following week. The place looked larger than he remembered. A delivery truck stood near the workshop. Workers were unloading boxes from several repair shops. A separate building now held fabricated tools. The original tractors still sat in numbered rows, but many had been stripped of their most useful parts. Grant walked into the workshop and waited until Daniel finished speaking with a customer. "You have grown?" Grant said. Daniel nodded. "So has the demand." Grant placed a folder on the workbench. Inside was an offer to purchase the parts inventory, exchange program, fabrication equipment, and customer records. The number was substantial. It was enough for Daniel to repay every loan and leave with more money than he had ever imagined. Grant spoke carefully. "You built something valuable? We can expand it faster than you can." Daniel looked through the pages. Holloway had warehouses, delivery systems, trained sales staff, larger repair facilities. The company could move more parts and reach more customers. But Daniel also saw what was missing. The offer described inventory, equipment, property, and records. It did not describe the purpose behind the system. "What happens to the farmers with machines too old for your service department?" Daniel asked. "We would support profitable demand. That is how these tractors ended up behind your fence." Grant's expression hardened. "Business has to be efficient." "I agree. Then why keep parts that may sit for years? Because one of them may be the only part that keeps a farm moving." Grant closed the folder. "You cannot build a company around emotion." Daniel looked toward the exchange shelves. This company was built around solving expensive delays. He explained that the yard did not depend on one rare part. It depended on a system. Used components. Rebuilding. Fabrication. Mobile repair. Exchange inventory. Regional delivery. Knowledge collected from every failure. Each part of the business supported the others. Grant wanted to buy the visible assets. Daniel believed the real value was in how they worked together. He pushed the folder back. "I am not selling." Grant stared at him. "You may never receive another offer like this." "That may be true. You are turning down security." Daniel shook his head. "I already have security. It comes from not depending on one product." Grant left without another word. The story spread quickly. Some people thought Daniel had made a foolish decision. Others understood. The dealership had once thrown away every broken tractor because none of them looked profitable alone. Daniel had built his business by combining small pieces of value into one larger system. Now the same dealer wanted to own the result. The power had reversed. Holloway still sold newer machines. Daniel kept older ones working. There was room for both businesses. But only one had learned how much value remained after the first sale ended. The tractors Holloway discarded had become Daniel's inventory. The failed parts had become his exchange network. The scrap had become equipment. The records had become knowledge. And the customers the dealership had stopped serving had become the foundation of his empire. Daniel's business did not become an empire because he opened a chain of polished dealerships. It became an empire because the yard stopped depending on one kind of work. By the fourth year, the operation had 6 connected divisions. The first was the salvage yard itself. Every tractor that arrived was inspected before anything was removed. Workers recorded the serial number, model, engine family, major damage, and parts that appeared intact. A machine with a destroyed engine might still have a valuable rear axle. A tractor damaged in a rollover might contain a usable transmission. A burned machine could still provide wheels, lift arms, or hydraulic parts from the section the fire never reached. The second division was rebuilding. This area handled pumps, starters, steering units, lift controls, and other components that could be restored. Each part followed the same process. It was disassembled, cleaned, measured. Damaged pieces were replaced. The rebuilt unit was tested before it received a label. Daniel refused to let the company grow faster than its standards. Every employee knew the story of Robert Hale's failed transmission gear. The broken gear still hung above the main workbench. It reminded them that a part could fit perfectly and still be wrong. The third division was fabrication. The original fabrication area had started with one workbench and a homemade log splitter. Now it occupied its own building. Workers turned recovered steel into practical farm equipment. Bale attachments, trailer supports, engine stands, grading blades, simple hydraulic tools. Daniel avoided producing machines that were too complex to repair locally. He wanted every tool to be strong, understandable, and serviceable with common equipment. The fourth division was mobile repair. 2 service trucks traveled across several counties. Each carried gauges, O's, seals, filters, bearings, and common rebuilt components. The purpose of the trucks was not to arrive with the most expensive answer. It was to find the actual failure before the farmer spent money. Sometimes the problem was a rare part. Sometimes it was a cracked hose worth less than a full tank of fuel. Daniel required every mobile mechanic to diagnose first and quote, second. That rule became one of the company's strongest sources of trust. The fifth division was the exchange network. Small repair shops collected failed components and sent them to Daniel's yard. In return, they received credit or tested replacements. A damaged pump from one county might provide the housing needed for a rebuild in another. A failed steering unit could contribute a shaft, cover, or control arm. Parts moved through the system instead of stopping at the scrap bin. The sixth division was the records department. This was the quietest part of the company, but Daniel considered it the most important. The original notebooks had been converted into a searchable database. Workers could enter a casting number and find every known machine that used it. They could compare dimensions, revisions, common failures, and test results. They could see whether a part was an exact match, a verified substitute, or an untested possibility. The system did not eliminate human judgment. It made judgment more reliable. Daniel hired retired mechanics to review older records. Many of them carried knowledge that had never been written down. They remembered which models shared engines, which housings cracked, which replacement numbers had changed, which parts looked identical but failed under different loads. Daniel paid them to document what they knew. That decision preserved experience that otherwise would have disappeared. The business also created a training program for younger workers. Apprentices learned to read part numbers, inspect metal, rebuild components, and diagnose systems. They also learned when to say no. Daniel told every new hire the same thing. A farmer can recover from a delayed repair. He may not recover from a part we knew was unsafe. The company's growth became visible across the region. Repair shops displayed signs showing they participated in Daniel's exchange network. Service trucks carried the company name. Fabricated tools appeared on farms far beyond the original county. Farmers called the main yard before giving up on older equipment. Grant Holloway saw the change clearly. His dealership still sold expensive new tractors. Daniel's company supported the machines that remained after the warranty, the official inventory, and sometimes the manufacturer's interest had ended. They served different moments in the life of the same equipment. One morning, Daniel stood on a raised loading platform overlooking the yard. The original 43 tractors were almost gone. Some had become hundreds of separate parts. Some had become rebuilt assemblies. Some had become tools. Some had been recycled only after every useful possibility had been exhausted. The machines themselves had disappeared. The system built from them had expanded. Trucks entered one gate, carrying failed parts and broken equipment. Other trucks left carrying tested components, repaired machines, and newly fabricated tools. Nothing moved randomly anymore. Every item had a record. Every repair added information. Every failure improved the next inspection. That was the empire Daniel had built. Not a monument to old tractors. A network that understood how to recover value after everyone else had stopped looking. The dealership had thrown away complete machines because it could no longer profit from them as wholes. Daniel had built a company from the pieces, and by connecting those pieces through testing, records, repair, fabrication, and trust, he created something far more valuable than the tractors had ever been on their own. 5 years after Daniel bought the discarded tractors, the old feed yard no longer looked temporary. The broken fences were gone. The leaking workshop had been rebuilt. A second warehouse stood where weeds once covered the ground. Service trucks left before sunrise, carrying rebuilt parts and repair tools to farms across the region. Inside the main building, workers inspected pumps, transmission, steering units, and hydraulic assemblies under bright lights. Outside, damaged tractors still arrived on trailers, but they no longer entered the yard as waste. They entered as inventory, information, and future work. One autumn morning, Daniel received a request from a farmer named Eli Mercer. Eli had inherited a tractor from his grandfather. The machine had worked the same land for nearly 40 years, but its engine had finally failed beyond practical repair. A dealership had already inspected it. Their recommendation was simple: replace the tractor. Eli did not have the money. More importantly, he did not want to send his grandfather's machine directly to scrap. He brought it to Daniel's yard on a flatbed trailer. The tractor looked tired. Its paint had faded to a dull red. One headlight was missing. The seat had been repaired with layers of tape. The engine block was cracked, and the rear tires were nearly worn smooth. Eli stood beside it while Daniel inspected the major systems. "Can you save it?" he asked. Daniel looked carefully before answering. Years earlier, he might have felt pressure to say yes. Back then, every successful restoration seemed like proof that his idea was right. Now he understood that honest judgment mattered more than dramatic rescue. "The complete tractor is not worth rebuilding," Daniel said. Eli looked down at the ground. Daniel continued, "But that does not mean the machine is finished." The rear lift assembly was still sound. The steering housing could be rebuilt. The wheel centers were valuable. Several transmission gears showed limited wear. The hydraulic control unit matched models still operating throughout the county. Even the steel hood, though dented, could be restored as a keepsake. Daniel explained each possibility. Eli listened. "So it can still help other tractors?" "Yes." "How many?" Daniel looked over the machine again. "Possibly several." Eli agreed to leave it. He removed the old nameplate from the hood and took it home. The rest of the tractor entered Daniel's system. Workers photographed it, recorded the serial number, and documented its condition. The machine was dismantled over several days. Its lift assembly later repaired a tractor used by a cattle farmer. The steering housing became part of a rebuilt unit sent to a repair shop 2 counties away. The transmission gears entered tested inventory. The wheel centers were matched with new rims. The heavy steel from the frame was cut for shop equipment. Only a small portion went directly to recycling. Eli's tractor never returned to the field as one machine, but its work continued in several places. That was the principle Daniel's company had been built on. Not every machine could be restored. Not every part could be reused. Not every repair made financial sense. But value should be examined before it was discarded. The dealership had once judged equipment by a narrow question: can this tractor still be sold whole? Daniel had built an empire by asking a wider one: what useful work remains inside it? That afternoon, Grant Holloway arrived without an appointment. He was older now. The dealership still operated, but its business had changed. New equipment sales remained strong. Yet Holloway had quietly started referring older machine customers to Daniel's company. Grant walked through the yard and stopped near the loading area. A truck was being filled with rebuilt components for 4 different repair shops. Nearby, apprentices were dismantling Eli's tractor. Grant watched them label each part. "We used to throw all of that away," he said. Daniel nodded. "You did not have a system for it. We did not think it was worth building one." That was the difference. Grant looked toward the warehouses. "You built all this from those first tractors?" "They were the beginning." Grant seemed to expect more. Daniel pointed to the workers. "Records office, repair trucks, fabrication building, and exchange inventory." The tractors provided material. The business came from understanding what to do with it. That was the truth. Metal alone had not created the company. Knowledge had, testing had, records had, trust had, the willingness to look longer than everyone else had. Near sunset, Daniel walked to the far side of the yard. The last frame, from the original group of 43 tractors, stood near the fence. Almost every useful part had been removed. The remaining structure was too damaged for repair and too incomplete for display. A worker asked whether it should finally be sent to recycling. Daniel looked at it for a moment. That frame represented where the company had started, but keeping it only for memory would contradict everything the yard stood for. "Cut out the sound sections," he said. "Use them for the new training benches. And the rest? Recycle it." The worker marked the frame for processing. Daniel did not feel that the first tractors were disappearing. They had already spread across the region. Their pumps lifted equipment. Their gears moved harvest wagons. Their steel supported tools. Their failures had become records. Their parts had trained new mechanics. What had been left behind had become the foundation for something larger than any one machine. The dealership had thrown away every broken tractor because it believed the value ended when the machine stopped running. Daniel built his empire by proving that the end of one job could be the beginning of many others. And in the fields surrounding the town, old tractors continued to work with parts taken from machines that had once been declared worthless.